So I've just been summarizing the work of Henry Corbin in relation to sort of 21st century response to metacrisis and meaning crisis. And now I'm going to continue with the rest of chapter 5, namely it's called The Angel and Individuation. This is in Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. And yes, chapter 5, The Angel and Individuation, part 2, Disciples of Khidr, from page 144. And so what Corbin has been talking about is the importance of sort of practicing so as to distinguish between the imagination or fantasy and what he calls imaginal. The claim being made that that's sort of more connected to what's real rather than less connected to what's real. And I believe that Corbin understands the sort of inner purification, inner cleansing is sort of the way to do this. And he's oriented to sort of this individualized path, sort of against the dogma of collectivisms. And so for him, it's sort of deeply internal and individual pathway of sort of spiritual development. And he understands, if I'm to take Cheetham rightly, I think, that there are certain figures or guides that can sort of appear internally in this imaginal way that can appear so as to help with this. And I'm understanding that this kind of literally it's like an invisible inner guide is different than the divine double. And so what I need to do from here is to continue into Corbin and try to get a sense for what he means and how this might be relevant. And I've already done quite a bit of evaluation so far in the last video where I contextualize this and what I think to be the questions and problems that are relevant. So I'm going to continue from here and see what I can find. Cheetham says, in creative imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, Corbin devotes considerable attention to the topic of the invisible guide. In a characteristic move, he suggests that whether one has or does not have such a guide depends upon, quote, a crucial existential decision. Okay, and so I will go into this. I just want to mention very briefly that the points that I made were about the importance of the collective intelligence of groups in helping us to clarify the relationship between imaginal and imagination that is not being appreciated here at all. I don't think. And what else? Oh yeah, the other one would be not just groups, but the intentional practice of those groups. The whole point of the ecology of practices is that it can help us with this. And this, I feel, is a far more reasonable sort of beginning place. And then I would say that within that context, we could additionally explore the importance, perhaps, of a kind of existential decision to have an inner guide. And I just want to be very conscious and aware of the risk of self-deception and, frankly, bullshit. But anyway, this whether or not one has a guide is apparently dependent on a crucial existential decision. And he says that this decision, this Corbin, it prefigures and conditions a whole chain of spiritual development with far-reaching consequences. For it announces either that each human being is oriented toward a quest for his personal invisible guide, or that he entrusts himself to the collective magisterial authority as the intermediary between himself and revelation. Cheetham says that this echoes Luther's condemnation of the church. Okay, so for me, there is a clear mistake here, which is that I'm not saying, and again, I hope that I've been clear throughout. I'm not saying that the collective, well, in a way, I am saying that, actually. I do think that the collective intelligence of groups is an extremely valuable intermediary to revelation. But I also think we've seen, sort of time and time again, all of this sort of um, fallen fallen sociology, which I've talked about through Jordan Hall, as sort of since the Holocene, since we started living in a sedentary way, we forgot a lot of stuff, um, and further before that as well. So civilization itself is an inherently unstable social form. The idea being that if we could understand that and sort of, yeah, sort of do better design in groups, then I don't see why. Like I think from that place, there is a clear feedback loop between the collective and revelation itself. If we're oriented to the importance of that, and if we appreciate that, I might mention, for example, this is through Jamie Wheel. There's sort of there are different indigenous peoples whose when people they go through many different layers of initiation before they have access to the sources of revelation that exist within those cultures. But when they and that's important because you sort of can't just jump all the way to the end because you have to work on yourself, and it's in the collective that happens. But then there's a direct feedback between the revelation itself and the culture of the groups. So the revelations get fed back down into the culture. And so it is possible for them to go well together. It doesn't have to be the one has to choose between one's own spiritual development and the authority of the collective as intermediary. If we can imagine that there could be a different way of conceiving of the relationship between them, and that actually both might be extremely valuable to have a sort of inner personal guide as a kind of intermediary, and to have the collective intelligence of groups as an intermediary. It may also be worth saying that there are different kinds of revelation, and that different kinds of revelation may be available either to individuals and to groups. And then we want to work to clarify what kinds of revelation are in a way most valuable or most needed. I'm not sure. But I think, yeah, if there was a little bit more imagination here, ironically enough, that we don't have to make this choice that is being claimed that we do. Okay, so with that, we're now going to talk a little bit about Ibn Arabi. Cheetham says, for Corbin, Ibn Arabi is a symbol, as important perhaps as Suhrawardi, is a symbol of the triumph of the individual soul over the servitude to rational philosophy, and equally to the God created in dogmas. Ibn Arabi's triumph is the fruit of a long quest, the work of an entire lifetime. And this is because of his orientation towards the personal face of the Lord. Okay, the footnote says that Corbin's interpretation of Ibn Arabi is controversial. Chittick writes, Corbin's rhetorical flourishes and passion for the subject put his work into a unique category. He's concerned with his own philosophical project. Any reader of creative imagination soon begins to wonder where Ibn Arabi ends and Corbin begins. The lines are not clear, especially if one does not have access to the Arabic texts. Certainly, we come to realize that Ibn Arabi is a kind of precious larder from which all sorts of delicious victuals can be extracted. But most people familiar with the original text would agree that Corbin has highly individual tastes. I already picked up on that. And again, this is reinforcing what I'm saying. Okay, so let's continue. We're now going to quote from Corbin about Ibn Arabi, who says, Ibn Arabi was, and never ceased to be, the disciple of an invisible master, a mysterious prophet figure, to whom a number of traditions, both significant and obscure, lend features which relate him, or tend to identify him with Elijah. with St. George and still others. Ibn Arabi was above all the disciple of Khidr. Now, Cheetham, in a real sense, the central questions for Corbin's Voyager are who is Khidr and what does it mean to be a disciple of Khidr? It is the answer to these questions that will determine the course of our spiritual voyage. Okay, so I think I'm to understand that sort of in a way, Corbin has taken Ibn Arabi as a model through a particular interpretation, and that for Ibn Arabi, this figure of Khidr was the kind of inner spiritual guide that Corbin is pointing us to the need for, and that's why there end up being these questions like, who is Khidr and what does it mean to be his disciple? Betham continues. In Norman O'Brown's analysis, what Corbin and Massignon have shown us is that these are the central questions for the prophetic tradition after Muhammad, and these questions are the legacy of Islam for the Western post-Christian world. They stand at the center of Corbin's work. Again, these questions are the legacy of Islam for the Western post-Christian world. Corbin outlines the Quranic source for this person, capitalized. In Surah XVIII, which is that 18? I think I'm right in saying in Surah 18, Roman numerals, the figure that came to be interpreted as Khidr appears in an enigmatic episode. Quote, Moses and his servant travel to, quote, the meeting place of the two seas. This has been in Jung. But anyway, there he meets, this is Moses, there he meets an unnamed messenger. And now a quote from Corbin. This unnamed messenger is represented as Moses' guide, who initiates Moses into the science of predestination. Thus he reveals himself to be the repository of an inspired divine science, superior to the law, the Sharia. Thus, Khidr is superior to Moses insofar as Moses is a prophet, invested with the mission of revealing a Sharia. He reveals to Moses precisely the secret, mystic truth, or hakikah, that transcends the Sharia. And this explains why the spirituality inaugurated by Khidr is free from the servitude of the literal religion. Okay. Let's continue. Cheetham says, the function of Khidr as a person archetype, again, quote, person archetype, for both Surawadi and Ibn Arabi his function is to reveal himself, to reveal each disciple to himself. To reveal each disciple to himself. He leads each disciple to his own theophany, because that theophany corresponds to his own inner heaven, to the form of his own being, to his eternal individuality. Khidr's mission consists in enabling you to attain to the Khidr of your being. For it is in this inner depth, for it is in this inner depth, in this prophet of your being, that springs the water of life, at the foot of the mystic Sinai, pole of the microcosm, center of the world, etc. Okay, again, I'm not confused about this, but I'm questioning it because I think the whole point earlier was to sort of cultivate this relationship between sort of earthly and celestial aspects of the soul, where the upper one was conceived of as the divine double. And the way to do that sort of requires this differentiation of imagination and, in the imaginal and fantasy. And this guide was conceived of as important to help us do that. But now the guide in the figure as the figure of Khidr through Surawadi and Ibn Arabi is appearing as sort of the source of revelation. Maybe that's not fair. I'll read the quote again. It said, the function of Khidr as a person archetype is to reveal each disciple to himself. He leads each disciple to his own theophany, because that theophany corresponds to his own inner heaven, to the form of his own being, to his eternal individuality. Khidr's mission consists in enabling you to attain to the Khidr of your being. For it is in this inner depth, in this prophet of your being, that springs the water of life at the foot of the mystic Sinai, pole of the microcosm, center of the world. Okay, so I did misunderstand that. So it may be true that, maybe fair to say that some kind of inner spiritual guide in this way can guide one toward successive insight, reduction in self-deception is possible, and sort of further along the pathway to our own inner depths in this way, or heights, depending which way you want to talk about it. Cheetham says, and speaking of the study of Ibn Arabi's work itself, Corbin writes, quote, it goes without saying that the form in which each of us receives the master's thought conforms to his inner heaven. That is the very principle of the theophanism of Ibn Arabi, who for that reason can only guide each man individually to what he alone is capable of seeing, and not bring him to any collective pre-established dogma. Okay. Recall the statement from Corbin's work on Avicenna, quote, the more perceptions and representations of the universe each monad or soul integrates, the more it unfolds its own perfection and differs from every other. The more perceptions and representations of the universe each monad integrates, each soul integrates, the more it unfolds its own perfection and differs from every other. I mean, this would seem to comport with what I've talked about as the development of the soul, so I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Here we encounter this ideal, this expansive ideal of the fundamental freedom of unity through plurality. Again, freedom of unity through plurality. Yeah, so I would say that this is important, but I would say that this unity and plurality thing can be understood in terms of one's own inner world and inner worlds, but it can also be understood interpersonally, where we can conceive of sort of each person in the way that they see things as a world, as a cosmology. So I think the mistake, I think, would be a kind of what I would talk about as a kind of Kierkegaardian mistake, which is sort of, yeah, taking it all within, and not that that's not valuable. I get why that's valuable, but there's anyway. I'm saying, okay, fine, there's unity through plurality, but I don't see why that has to be just a within an intrapsychic process. I think it's just as much extra psychic or interpersonal in relation to nature and the world. But maybe they're not opposed to that. Quote, if the soul attains to the Khidr of its being, to its perfection, then you can indeed do what Khidr does. Now, a quote from Corbin who says, and this is perhaps the secret reason for which the doctrine of Ibn Arabi was so feared by the adepts of the literal religion, of the historical faith, of the dogma imposed uniformly upon all. He who is the disciple of Khidr possesses sufficient inner strength to seek freely the teaching of all masters. Okay, that's interesting. Cheetham continues, this unwavering emphasis on spiritual freedom in Corbin's work should not be misunderstood. The personal guide is not chosen by the ego. The dangers of subjective dilet oh, dilettantism, the dangers of subjective dilettantism or of an ill-prepared soul are clearly laid out. Psychosis and schizophrenia have already been mentioned. There are more risks other than psychosis and schizophrenia that have not been mentioned. It does not suffice to want Khidr as a guide, and souls as strong as Ibn Arabi are rare. In any case, such an event as the meeting with the guide can be so private, so intensely personal, that it cannot really be spoken of or revealed. Shea again, who knew Corbin well, comments, whether Corbin may have been personally initiated by the hermeneutic angel, whose pedagogical function he never ceased to valorize, we will never know. Okay. Certainly, Corbin knew well that Islam, as any religion, requires a doctrine, a literal outside, a law, which must exist in order for there to be anything in which to conceal the hidden meanings. That's a straw man in the extreme, by the way. But anyway, nonetheless, it is clear where his sympathies lie. The Ismailis have long been known among detractors and supporters both for the priority which they give to the esoteric at the expense of the esoteric, at the expense of the exoteric. Again, I would call this imbalance. Anyway, Corbin calls to our attention more than once with a kind of longing another symbolic event, with a kind of longing another symbolic event of that epochal 12th century, the Ismaili Declaration of Alamut. Corbin's quote goes, Alamut, the stronghold lost in the high solitary summits of the Elburz mountain chain to the southwest of the Caspian Sea, where on 8th of August 1164 the Great Resurrection was proclaimed. Undoubtedly, though, a proclamation of this type pertains to that spiritual history, the events of which occur unnoticed by external official history, because their implications cannot be suspected by historians whose attention is given exclusively to the latter. In any case, the proclamation of the Great Resurrection was intended to be the triumph of absolute spiritual hermeneutics, since it purely and simply abolished the Shariat and its observances in order to permit the reign of the spiritual idea alone to subsist. Okay, he also continues, here again, the impatience of the soul provoked a premature anticipation of eschatology. The major Shiite traditions continued carefully to maintain the coexistence of the exoteric and the esoteric. For as long as the human condition remains what it is in the present world, the soul cannot manifest itself without being contained in a material body. Okay, so from this, it's sort of clear to me that there may well be certain sort of quote unquote spiritual advantages or in some ways, and certain strengths that come from cultivating this capacity to of a kind of inner guide, such as Khidr, who's being talked about. But I don't see that the risks of self-deception are being talked about. And so to me, it's a little unrealistic, or again, a minority occupation in the extreme. And then we also have sort of seems that Corbin does have some sense of the importance of the exoteric, but I don't think sort of enough of it. enough of a sense of that. But anyway, let's continue with Cheetham, who says, as much as we might long for spiritual freedom and emancipation from all external laws, all public decrees, we cannot be entirely freed from the outer without falling into chaos. That condition is for the angels alone, as we shall see. Yeah, it's not just a question of sort of putting up with it. It's a question of working with it. And yeah, that kind of sucks sometimes. But I think if we sort of get stuck in this, oh, we wish that we didn't have to have that stuff, but we have to put up with it. I don't think that's sort of taking it far enough. So I would say that this points to the difficulty of imagining a different kind of relationship between esoteric and exoteric. Cheetham continues. The question of the inner guide versus the human master raises the question of the relation of the spiritual and the political. It's often not at all clear in reading Corbin that there is any politically important component in the history of the Shiites. In fact, he often remarks that it is when Shi'ism does come to political power that it is in most danger, that it is most in danger of betraying its inner trust. Success on the political front is the, quote, most formidable and paradoxical ordeal that an esoteric religion may undergo. Yeah, and so I just think that like, oh, it's a hard problem, therefore we won't deal with it at all. We'll just leave it to other people. And I'm like, well, it's fine to say that it's sort of difficult and challenging, formidable ordeal, yeah, but like, since when has that stopped us from trying to solve things in the past? It's like, oh, it's too hard. We'll just go do our own thing. Cheetham continues. It is, in fact, just the sacralization of institutions that is the prime symptom of metaphysical secularization. Hmm. He goes so far as to say, quote, the very idea of associating such concepts as power and the spiritual implies an initial secularization. In the West, the failure of the priesthood to gain secular power was the cause of the projection of a fiction of the same power, of a fiction of that same power into the supernatural. Okay, so there's a couple of ideas there from Corbin. The first idea being that it's when these sort of esoteric traditions sort of come into political power that they're most in danger of betraying their inner trust, and that it may political success may be a sort of formidable and paradoxical ordeal for esoteric religions. That and like yes, I think that's a risk. I think it could be accounted for if we take the problem seriously. Yes, it's a paradoxical and formidable ordeal. Since when has that stopped us? Then he says, it is in fact just the sacralization of institutions that is the prime symptom of metaphysical secularization. I'm not talking about the sacralization of institutions. I think through Jordan Hall and others, institutions are inherently unstable. And yeah, I'm not talking about that. And then Corbin said, this is Cheetham, he goes so far as to say, Corbin, quote, the very idea of associating such concepts as power and the spiritual implies an initial secularization. Um, Yeah, look, fair enough. I think but I think it's possible to sort of reduce power. And I think, like, what about Gandhi? Was Gandhi mistaken because he had power in the world, as a social force? What about MLK? It's kind of like if the revelation, if our spiritual insight is kind of the source of our deepest being in a way, and that our values and virtues in a way derive from that, well, in a way, isn't their relevance is that they come to be actual in the world, where that actualization of spirit can be conceived of reasonably as a form of power in the world. I don't think that kind of orientation. I mean, look, Joanna Macy is a good example of how sort of Buddhism, for example, can very much go together with sort of activism. Um, so I don't think that this association between the spiritual and power has to result in secularization. And then he said that in the West, the failure of the priesthood to gain secular power was the cause of the projection of a fiction of that same power into the supernatural. That's an interesting take. Like the priesthood had quite a lot of secular power, and they arguably they were sort of projecting into the supernatural long before science came along. But anyway, let's continue from that. Cheetham says his exclusively spiritual view of things makes him a poor guide to political or social history. Brown remarks that, quote, Corbin, indispensable in other ways, refuses to see any political dimension whatsoever in Ismaili or Shiite history. It is perhaps unfair to accuse him of being politically naive when his purpose is not to write political history. Yet it is wise to be aware of the limitations inherent in an exclusively spiritual perspective on history, particularly in view of the fact that the issue here is the source of legitimate authority in matters of the soul. A spirituality that is blind to political realities is in danger of falling into folly. It's a kind of funny word to use to describe it, but yes, I would radically agree with, like, thank you. Like, finally. Anyway, let's continue with Cheetham. And yet it may be that this is precisely the point we can take from his work. Whatever his shortcomings as a social historian, Corbin's writings can be understood as political. By showing that a metaphysics of individuation is necessary to counter the threat of totalitarianisms, he makes it clear that any spirituality that holds itself aloof from the temporal is doomed to the ineffectuality of the abstract. Through his attempt to reinstate the image in its rightful place in the scheme of things, Corbin attempts to restore balance to the lives of each of us, and thereby to the social world as well. Okay, that's a reasonable take, but to me, and that sort of in this way, Corbin can be sort of taken as inspiration for the project that I was talking about through Viveki and others. So that's very helpful in a way. James Hillman has seen this aspect of his work clearly. In reference to the nightmares of terrorism in the contemporary Islamic world, he commented, quote, Corbin said to me one time, what is wrong with the Islamic world is that it has destroyed its images. And without these images that are so rich in its tradition, they're going crazy because they have no containers for their extraordinary imaginative power. His work can be seen as political action of the first order. It was meeting terrorism, fanaticism, nihilism right at its roots in the psyche. Okay, well, that's helpful. So I think what I'm getting at is that there are many different readings of Corbin that are going on here, and that some people have been quite generous to him. Um, we can also sort of see that if we're wanting to deal with a sort of decline in image and the imaginal in all these different traditions, including the Islamic, then a prioritizing only of the esoteric probably isn't going to help, or has very limited utility. Anyway, let's continue just over the page here to the end. Cheetham says, it is the ideal of the balanced life that is at the heart of the Islamic vision. Ugh. Muhammad was simultaneously mystic and warrior, philosopher and statesman, and the biographies of many of the spiritual figures who Corbin represents tell a story of political engagement, not only scholarly spiritual retreat. We've already heard Nasser on just this point. Sufism enables one, quote, to lead an intense inner contemplative life while outwardly remaining most active in a world that he molds according to his inner spiritual nature, instead of becoming its prisoner. While Corbyn's passionate defense of the centrality and the cosmic function of the individual is not in question, there may remain uneasiness about the relation between esoteric doctrines and the democratic ideals of the West. Esoteric spiritual disciplines have never been given over to the masses in theory. The hidden mysteries cannot be public. Recall the remarks of the sixth Imam, quote, as for the rest, they are as the foam rolled along by the torrent. Quote, our democratic ideals have sometimes been interpreted as meaning that all men are created equal. What this should signify is that all people must be free to find their angel. If all people were truly equal, then the reign of totalitarian regimes, whether political, religious, or scientific, based on a denial of individuality, would be unavoidable. Corbin presents an entire cosmology that guarantees the ontology of the unique. Yeah, so to me, it's getting sort of stuck in the same stuff. I mean, yes, I'm attuned to the importance of the unique and the individual as I've been pointing to all the way along, but there are all these other risks of as I've said, narcissism and spiritual bypassing and like that. So what about participation? Cheetham continues, yet this individualism cannot mean that we are reduced to nihilistic relativism. Corbin is no relativist. The subtle body does bear signs of a life well or poorly lived. There are consequences. You do make your own heaven and your own hell. There are absolute demands made upon us all. But this does not require a public dogma. This absolute is based upon the necessity for multiple faces of divinity, appearing differently to each person. Each of us must encounter our own angel. This doctrine derives in part from Ibn Arabi, who, in Chittick's words, quote, affirms an ultimate ground that must present itself through relativity. And, more important for human destiny, he stresses the personal dimension of this absolute ground, a dimension that's oriented toward human happiness. In short, the Shaykh provides a way of seeing religious teachings as both historically relative and as personally absolute. Cheetham says that a Sufi saying has it that there are as many paths to God as there are human souls. There are as many paths to God as there are human souls. And this perhaps explains how Corbin can say that Averroes, quote, was inspired by the idea that not all minds have the same degree of discernment. To some men, the literal aspect is addressed, while others are capable of understanding the hidden meaning. He knew that if what only the latter can understand were revealed to the former, the result would be psychoses and social disasters. Hmm. Cheetham finishes off. We Democrats can see the dangers of monarchy and fascism with some clarity. We understand the dangers of democracy less well. A democracy that exists within the Faustian space of the modern world and has thereby lost any sense of the modes of being and levels of knowing can no longer know either what a person is or what wisdom is. We've been taught that knowledge will make us free. But at the same time, we have come to confuse knowledge with wisdom, to believe that all knowledge is equally valuable, that anything we can do, we should do, and that by making all knowledge available to everyone, our problems will be solved. The metaphysical perspective that gives priority to facts is blind to persons. There is a fine line between the repression of individuality by totalitarian regimes, or totalizing discourses, and its evaporation into nihilism through the triumph of relativism, spiritual confusion, and the domination of the disoriented. It's the virtue of Corbyn's work to indicate how we might understand ourselves in order to avoid both Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. Okay, well, I mean, to finish this off, so yeah, so I mean, I certainly wouldn't deny the value of all of this. There seems to be, something profound here about this, sort of reorientation to the need for the development of wisdom, individuation, spiritual development, work with the soul, and so on. And esotericism and, direct connection to a personal God and to revelation and imaginal work can certainly be a part of that. I think we can understand why that's important as well. But I'm not convinced that Corbyn is balancing things as much as Cheetham seems to think he is. And I think the devil is in the details, and it's about what actually works. I think spirituality does have a relationship with politics and with the group. I'll have to leave it there. I'll try to think about what more I would like want to say about this. I think the main point that's missing here, I would say, is the importance of the collective intelligence of groups, and that it's not just a matter of sort of, tolerating democratic ideals, and it's not just a matter of, you know, oh yes, we need the exoteric as well because the stupid people need something. It's like what I'm saying is that there are actually certain, I guess you could say, types, classes, forms of spiritual revelation and personal development that are only available in groups. That could still comport with the esoteric. Um, yeah, and I think the danger there is this sort of, I think I would refer to sort of fractal relationality, where like if it's, I mean, look, there are so many communities in the world that sort of insulate themselves, and um, if it's the Amish, then it's like, oh, let's just sort of weave baskets instead, and they get outcompeted a lot. This is the game theory stuff. So we need people to show up and be involved, not sort of leave the running of the world to lesser people. And yeah, esoteric communities can be very insular, but I'll have to leave it there. And I'll come back to chapter 6, which is called Tawil and Prophetic Philosophy, the key to the soul and the key to the world. I think part of the virtue of all this is that it points to the need for genuine innovation. I don't think we have the solutions because they haven't been found yet.